The stuff like what we just saw, that's called spoken word. I always have enjoyed that. I find that really interesting. I think that it's fascinating how words have such power, and yet, like, if I were to just take that script and just read it to you, you'd be bored out of your mind. And yet there's something about the presentation that makes us kind of lean into it. That's because when it comes to words, like who is saying the words and in what context they're saying the words, that's what gives the words power. That's why two different people can say the exact same phrase and it means something completely different. For example, a guy, he works up his courage and finally tells the girl that he has a crush on, "I love you." Trying to communicate, red roses and candlelight, butterflies in the stomach. And his crush can look back at him and say, "Oh, I love you too, bud." Right? Ain't nothing romantic about that. You just got friend zoned. It was the same phrase. But because of who's saying it and how they're saying it, the meaning of the whole thing changes. The power that words have, ultimately, is less about the words themselves and more about who's saying them and in what context. Tonight, we are going to look at 3 words, just 3 words, just one little phrase. And yet, because of who said it and when they said it, these words have power, incredible power, eternal power. The speaker was Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God. And when he said it, the context in which he said these 3 words, they were the very last things he said before he died. Now, the manner in which Jesus died, the Bible devotes chapter after chapter to his crucifixion, to the manner in which he died. I mean, chapter after chapter describes the suffering and the pain that Jesus went through. But basically, it began with Jesus was with his followers, and this angry mob shows up to arrest him. And they take him to the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees and the high priests, and there he's beaten and mocked and laughed at. From there they take him to the Roman authorities, and the Roman authorities beat him, and then they flog him, which was a form of torture where a whip that had like glass and pieces of pottery and stone intertwined in the cords. They would lay that whip across someone's back, and then as they tore it backwards, it would tear flesh and skin right off of the person. It was a horrible punishment. He was flogged, and they made him carry his own cross to the top of the hill, where they drove spikes through his wrists and through his feet. On a wooden cross, they then put up vertical so that he was hanging by the weight, hanging his weight on those spikes in his wrists, making it difficult to breathe. And for hours, this went on. Until what John 19 tells us. In John 19, we're told how this all ends. Specifically, John 19, verse 28. This is after all of that. Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scripture, "I thirst." And a jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch, and they held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. It is finished. The Bible tells us there were a lot of different groups of people that were there at Jesus' crucifixion. And while the Bible doesn't necessarily articulate exactly what they thought in this moment, it tells us enough about who these people were that we maybe could guess what their reaction was. The first group of people that was there were the Roman guards themselves, the Roman soldiers. They were soldiers deployed to a foreign, backwards, redneck country, at least from their point of view. And their role there was basically to put down criminals and insurrectionists. Like, that was their job. And so what they did is they crucified criminals. What they did is they put down revolutionaries. That was their job. And so when they heard Jesus say, "It is finished," they probably just thought, job's done. Time to clock out, go home, eat a meal, go to bed, wake up tomorrow and do it all again. Just another common criminal. Another group of people there were the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the high priests. They believed Jesus was a blasphemer and a heretic. They believed that Jesus was kind of stirring up this dissension in the people that was messing with their power structure, their powerful position in that culture. And so they thought that Jesus was a problem. They're the ones that had Jesus arrested in the first place. And when they were there and they heard Jesus say, "It is finished," they probably thought the nightmare is over. The nightmare is over. Finally, things can get back to how they were. They can get back to how they were supposed to be. Jesus' followers were there. These were the men and the women who had committed years of their lives to following Jesus. They'd left family, they'd left jobs, they'd left friends, they'd left their homes, they'd lived homeless, many of them, with Jesus for years because they believed that Jesus was going to institute a new period, a new era of prosperity and power and faithfulness in Israel. And they watched Jesus say, "It is finished," and probably thought that their hope died with him. And then the guy we've been talking about, Peter. You know, the Bible actually doesn't specifically say whether or not Peter was there, that maybe after denying Jesus, he never came back to actually watch the crucifixion. But there are some verses in Luke that seem to indicate that maybe he was there. We're not positive, but if he was, you can imagine what he thought. Jesus said, "It is finished," and he thought to himself, there goes my chance to ask him for forgiveness. A chance to make it up to him somehow. The last thing I did before Jesus died was I betrayed him. Peter probably thought that his failure would be the defining thing about him for the rest of his life. All four of those groups had one thing in common. They were all wrong. Dead wrong. Those Romans that thought he was a common criminal, in just a couple of centuries, their whole empire would be dismantling their religious system to worship that common criminal. And the Jewish leadership, they thought things were going to go back to normal. It was never going to go back to normal because in 50 days, on the day of Pentecost, thousands of Jews were going to give their lives to Jesus to be baptized in his name, beginning a movement that has not stopped or slowed down since. The disciples were wrong because their king was not going to stay dead, and they were actually going to take the borders of his kingdom far beyond the walls of Israel or far beyond the walls of Jerusalem. And Peter was wrong because his failure wouldn't define him. Jesus would restore him and forgive him face to face. And Jesus would become the leader, the bold, fearless leader of the church that Jesus called him in the first place, and he would never deny his Lord again until he was crucified for not denying Jesus. They were all wrong because as they watched Jesus die on that cross, and it's hard to blame them, everyone would have probably heard "it is finished" as a statement of defeat, but it wasn't. It was a declaration of victory. When Jesus said "it is finished," it was a declaration of victory. Because in that moment, Jesus took our sin and broke it, took our sin and defeated it. He claimed victory over our sin and offers that victory to us. When he said "it is finished," what he meant by that was the plan that God had put in place millennia before that moment had finally come to completion. Mission accomplished. It is finished. But to kind of appreciate that, right, the whole context of this, we got to go way back, like way, way, way back, like the first interaction that God ever had with humanity. The first time God ever interacted with humanity, it basically set up this what's called a covenant. A covenant is this two-way relationship, a relationship where each person brings something to the table, like a marriage. Both sides promise to love and honor and cherish each other till death do us part. Both of them are bringing something to the table. It's called a covenant. God set that up with humanity from the very beginning, and the basics of that covenant was God promised to bless, and we promised to obey. That's basically what that covenant was. I mean, you can see it in Adam and Eve. God blessed Adam and Eve. I mean, he gave them life. That was the first blessing, but then he gave them the world, and then he gave them freedom, and he gave them himself. He was present with them, walking with them in the garden. He promised to bless them, and he showered blessings on top of them, and the expectation that Adam and Eve would bring to the table was that they would love and obey. But Adam and Eve broke that covenant. They violated that covenant. They did exactly what they were asked not to do, what they had promised not to do. They sinned. They did the opposite of what God called them to do. And when they did that, they were punished. They deserved that punishment. And the punishment for breaking that covenant was that they had to die and be separated from God. And that covenant doesn't just apply to Adam and Eve alone. The Bible basically sets it up as that covenant applies to all of us. That God brings himself to the table and he brings his blessings to the table, but we are called to love and obey him. And like Adam and Eve, you and I, we have failed to do that from the very beginning. Every human that has ever lived has failed to do that. And every day we break that covenant with God, and we deserve the same punishment. Now, some of you may hear that and say, dude, that is harsh. But just remember that we're not towards the end of the story yet. So the Old Testament, right? Like more than half the Bible, like this, more than this. All of this is essentially about the fact that God has set up a covenant. This two-way relationship between humanity and himself. And it's about the fact that we violated that covenant by sinning. Our sin breaks that covenant, that we deserve that punishment of death and separation from him. But it's also about the fact that from the beginning, from the first moment we broke our covenant, God had a plan in place to save us from the punishment of our sins. That is what the Old Testament is about. Everything in the Old Testament is about that. Are you with me? Are you with me? Yes? Okay, good. Because we're going to take everything I just said, and we're going to look at a really weird story. It's an awesome story, but it's a weird story that takes everything I just said and puts it in one little package, but also kind of a weird package. So I need you with me. You with me? Yes. Okay. Genesis 15. Another picture of the covenant that God makes with man. God has called a man named Abraham to be his follower. And God has promised Abraham, I will bless you and I will make you a blessing to others. That's God's promise. That's what he's bringing to the table. I will bless you and I will make you a blessing to others. That's the basics of it. And Abraham has promised to follow God and obey God and worship God. That's Abraham's side of it. The way the Bible describes is that he's going to be our God and Abraham's going to be God's people. That's the covenant, the two-way agreement. But what happens with this agreement, I just love. Maybe it's just me. I have a weird sense of humor. There's something about this that always makes me laugh. Abraham does something really funny. God has made this promise to Abraham, and he's like elaborating on it. God's excited about this. Man, he's not like, okay, I guess I'll bless you. No. He's like, dude, I can't wait to tell you all the things I'm going to do. You're going to have tons of offspring, and they're going to be a blessing to everybody. I'm going to give you all this land, and God's elaborating on it, right? He's just describing all these incredible things that he's going to do for Abraham. And Abraham, in Genesis 15, he's kind of basically interrupts God and says, "Oh Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" Translation, hey, God, hey, no. I mean, like, awesome. Thank you for all those things you're going to give me, sweet. But hey, I'm going to need this in writing. I'm going to need this in writing. Listen, like I know you're saying, but like, I really need to know this is going to happen. So I'm going to need this, let's make this official. So God's like, okay. All right, we'll make this official. So he tells Abraham to get him some stuff. He says, bring me a heifer 3 years old. If you don't know what a heifer is, ask someone in Effingham. Effingham, woo! Yeah. Woo! Okay. Bring me a heifer 3 years old. Bring me a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And Abraham got all those things. He brought him all these things. He cut them in half, and he laid each half over the other. Things start getting weird here. See, if you and I try to ever make a contract, like if you come up to me and say, yeah, I got this business deal idea, or let's work something out, and there's going to be a covenant thing. You're going to say you're going to do something. I'm going to say I'm going to do something. We're going to bring this thing together. The way we'd work that out in these days is there'd be paperwork. We'd be signing on dotted lines, having things notarized, witnesses would be involved, and then we'd file it with some court. And within that paperwork, it would describe, this is what will happen if you violate your side of this contract. That's how we do things these days. That's not how they did it back then. Back then, they were a little bit more hands-on. Have you ever, as a kid, did you ever make a promise, and after you made the promise, you said, cross my heart? You ever do that? You never do that? Can you finish that statement with me? For anyone that's ever done it, cross my heart and what? Hope to die. Does anybody know the next part? Stick a needle in my eye. A little dark for children, right? It's like how Ring Around the Rosie is about the Black Death. Did y'all know that? There's some dark stuff going on in that. But the idea behind it is you're saying, I am so committed to keeping this promise to you that if I don't keep this promise, may I die. May a needle be jammed in my eye hole, right? That's basically what's going on. It's dark, but it communicates something. It communicates, I'm taking this promise seriously. really seriously. And that kind of idea has its origins back in Abraham's day. Because the idea of, I'm going to do something, I'm going to basically say, I'm going to keep this promise, and if I don't keep this promise, may horrible things happen to me. That's what's going on in Genesis 15. See, what they would do is they get an animal, and they get a knife. Listen. So many of you have asked me, why were you carrying the zebra around? Okay, listen, I promise you, no amount of whining is going to keep this from happening. This is happening. It's happening. Now, also, my favorite part about this is, normally when I would do something this stupid, you'd all have your phones out. And like later, there'd be like a picture with like Cam like tagged in it, like look at what Marcus did or whatever. So now, yeah, I know, right? Okay, so now, leader's taking advantage of it. So now we're just gonna live in this moment together. That's all that's happening. I will take your phone, Ian. I will take it. Oh, you didn't think I could see you. Ha ha! So they would take an animal, and they'd take a knife. And what they would do is they would slaughter said animal. My grandfather told me how to use a knife. He'd be rolling over in his grave right now. I'm cutting towards myself. Okay. Wait. Yeah. CrossFit, right? Okay. They'd tear the animal in half, basically, and then they'd spread the pieces on either side. Blood, the guts, the pieces, they put it in 2 rows on either side. And then they would do this. As they're making their agreement, they would walk between the animal, walk through all the guts, walk through all the nastiness, and say, this is my promise to you, and if I do not keep my promise, may I become like this animal. May I be destroyed. May I be torn into pieces. And the other person would go, and they'd walk through the pieces as well and say, this is my part of the agreement, and if I don't keep my side, may I become like this animal. And that's how you made in a covenant. It was the ancient version of cross my heart and hope to die. Just a little bit more hands-on. Now, what this means is that God and Abraham have entered into a covenant agreement together. They've said their sides of the promises. And this is how they're going to seal it. They're going to make it official. And then they've gotten all the animals, they've cut them up, and they put them on either side. Now, what should happen is that Abraham should walk through his pieces and say, God, I promise you that I will follow you, I will worship you, I will obey you, and if I don't, may this be what happens to me. And then God should walk through it and say, I promise to bless you and make you a blessing to other people, and if I don't, may this be what happens to me. That's what should happen. But listen to what happens in Genesis 15. Genesis 15, verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. Question: what went wrong? Abraham never walked through the pieces. What did go through? A smoking pot and a torch, both of whom represent who? God. God passed through the pieces twice. He passed through on his own behalf, and then he passed through on Abraham's behalf, which is the equivalent of saying, Abraham, may I be destroyed if I don't keep my promise to you, and may I be destroyed if you don't keep your promise to me. God says, Abraham, I am going to bless you, even if I have to die to do it. From the very beginning, from the earliest moments of God's interaction with people, he extended grace, undeserved gifts of love. And in this moment with Abraham, he said, I love you enough that no matter what you do, you will be blessed. I just may have to die to make it happen. See, Abraham ultimately, he did break his covenant with God. He sinned, he failed. He put his own desires before those of God. He disobeyed him. And when that happened, Abraham deserved to die, to be torn apart, and then remain apart from God. And you and I have done the same thing. We have failed. We have sinned. We have put our own desires for those of God. We have known what the right thing to do is and done the opposite. We deserve to be torn apart and remain apart from God. But from the beginning, God has said, I will pay the price for your sin, even though you're the one that has broken the side of our covenant. And that's exactly what Jesus chose to do when he went to the cross. He fulfilled this covenant. He paid the price that we owed, just like God said he would do from the beginning. Now, this has been a heavy day. A lot of talk about sin, suicide. Talk about shame and regret and betrayal. Talk about failure. And some of us struggle with that more than others. Some of us relatively naturally, I don't know how you do it, but relatively naturally you just kind of gravitate towards the love of Jesus. But others of us, and I would fall into this category, have a really hard time looking beyond our own failure. Have a really hard time looking beyond our own sin. And if that's you, then I want you to think about this aspect of the crucifixion of Jesus. Not just why he did it, but what the actual details of it were. See, Jesus chose you when he went to the cross. And he didn't choose you once. He chose you again and again and again. And some of you are going like, wait, Jesus was crucified multiple times? No. But listen to this. See, before everything happened, like before he actually got arrested, Jesus is with his buddies, and they're hanging out, and then all of a sudden that angry mob comes up, right? Think torches and pitchforks, okay? Beauty and the Beast, right? Dun 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 dun, right? You feeling me? Did I get that wrong? Nobody. Beauty and the Beast, come on, people. Kill the beast. Okay. Torches and pitchforks. And they show up, and Jesus says, hey, it's cool, guys. I'll just go with you. But Peter freaks out. He draws a sword, he's like, ah! He chops off a guy's ear, right? Jesus is like, oh, Peter, hey, my bad, man, my bad. You just, let me get that for you. Like 3-second rule, and he just popped it back on the guy's head, right? It's a loose translation. Then Jesus turns to Peter. He turns to Peter and he says, Peter, you goober, put up your sword. Again, loose translation. Says, dude, put up your sword. But then he actually does say this. He says, don't you know that if I asked my heavenly Father, he would send more than 12 legions of angels to save me? Peter, I'm not being forced to do anything. I'm choosing this. Now let's have some fun with math. Okay. What this means is, what Jesus said is this: while Jesus was taken by this angry mob, in heaven there are more than 12 legions of angels on war footing. They're geared up to go. And every legion had at least 6,000 soldiers in it, right? In the Roman legion, so 6,000. So Jesus is saying there's more than 72,000 angels in heaven geared up for war. All right, they're geared up. Now, angels aren't exactly slouches when it comes to combat. In the book of Isaiah, one angel took down 150,000 Assyrian soldiers by himself. Which means that if it takes 150,000 people to even slow an angel down, and there's 72,000 angels ready to go, do you want to know how many men or women in an army would be required to keep angels from getting Jesus from them? It's 10.8 billion. So while Jesus is in the hands of these guys who are laughing at him and spitting on him and slapping him, there are 72,000 grim-faced angels in heaven, cracking their necks and rolling their shoulders and sharpening their blades, just waiting, just itching to go down there because their king is in enemy hands. And one word from Jesus, just one word, and they would have turned Jerusalem into a pothole. greasy stain. Just one word. But Jesus didn't say, come. He had an out the whole time. It's not like the moment the mob showed up, Jesus didn't have an out anymore, like he was overpowered. He couldn't handle it anymore. No. He had an out the whole time, which means that every time one of those high priests laughed in his face, he chose you. And every time they slapped him in his face, he chose you. And every time they spit on him, he chose you. Every time a Roman soldier punched him, every time they laid that lash over his back, every single time that whip fell, he chose you. Every step he took up that hill, he chose you. Every hammer fall that drove those stakes into his wrists and feet, he chose you. Every ragged breath he took on that cross, he chose you because of his great love for you. Until he determined the price had been paid. And then he said, it is finished. And heaven roared because their king had won. I understand what it feels like to struggle, to feel the love of Christ, because you don't have that love for yourself. I know that. But Jesus chose you. Again and again and again, he chose you. He said you were worth it. And you have a choice before you tonight. The choice is basically this. It's a choice you can make now, and it's a choice that you can make every single day, but it's really clearly laid before you tonight. And the idea is this: you can spend time and you can focus on your failure, and you can focus on your shame, you can focus on your sin, you can focus on your regret. Or you can look at Jesus on the cross. And that self-hatred that you feel, and that difficulty that you feel, and that sense of I'm never really getting off the ground when it comes to me trying to relate to Jesus, that thing that happens because you're in bondage, because all you're doing is staring at your failure and your shame. If you turn your eyes to the cross of Jesus, you don't have time or energy for that anymore. Because the cross of Jesus is the scene of love and sacrifice that, though it is undeserved, it is very, very real. That's the choice before you tonight. And it reminds me of this, and I'll give you this last story and we'll be done. Reminds me of a song that you've heard a million times, a song that I've heard a million times as well. The song called How He Loves. In that song, it talks about the fact that focusing on the love of God prevents you from being able to focus on your own shame and failure. And I've heard that song a million times, and I'm not even sure I'm exaggerating. But I had this experience a few years ago that kind of changed the way that I experienced that song. And honestly, it changed the way that I experienced the cross. See, we were at the Effingham campus, and this was years ago, so it was before we had built the 810. We were still worshiping in the adult sanctuary at the time, and it was a Wednesday night. It was kind of prep time, and the band's up there, and they're rehearsing, and I was sitting back in the tech booth. And I remember that night that my son, Andrew, he was there. I don't even remember why he was there. I don't remember why he was there, but I remember around his age. He was around 2 years old. Around 2 years old, that's when kids get big enough and smart enough to know that they can climb things. And so Andrew's in the sanctuary, and he's recently discovered this ability, and he's just running through that sanctuary like a terror, right? He's like running like full speed at chairs, and then like slamming his stomach into them. Have you ever seen toddlers like climb up and stuff? He's like rolling himself onto it, and then he like climbs up, and he sprints down the chairs. He gets to the back, and the way the toddlers get off and stuff, like he puts himself back on his stomach and like backs down, and then he runs and he hits the other chairs. Full speed, just slamming into him, jumping up, laughing as he's running across chairs. And I'm listening to the band as they warm up and stuff, and I'm just laughing at my son in his insanity, you know. But that night, the band was playing How He Loves, and the rehearsal switched to that, and they started getting fired up for that. They started playing the song. And when they started playing the song, all of a sudden, like I felt like kind of something down to my left, so I looked down, and there's Andrew. And it was kind of weird because I had lost track of him like an hour ago. I'm just kidding. Okay. But, he's there, and he's giving the universal sign for pick me up, right? And it's so unlike Andrew. I mean, he had been basically carried around for the first year of his life. He'd finally discovered what it was to run and climb and stuff like that. He never wanted to be held anymore. But he's standing there, he's saying, hey, pick me up. And so I do, because, I'm at least a decent father, and I pick him up, and he immediately snuggled in. And he put his head on my shoulder. He put his arms around my neck. And he just sat there and let me hold him. I can't remember having held him like that before, since he was like a baby. And as I'm holding my son, my only son, I'm listening to that song, and I feel like I heard it for the first time. And I thought to myself, I know that the love of God is seen through the cross of Jesus. And I just asked myself, as I held this little guy, I asked myself, I said, how could God give up his son? Because God helped me, but I wouldn't give my son for anyone. I wouldn't give my son for anyone or anything. Ask me for anything else, but not my little boy. And as I thought about that, I thought, this doesn't make sense that God would be able to do that. It clicked, and I swear I'd heard it 1,000 times, but maybe it just never happened. In that moment, as I held Andrew and listened to how he loves, it hit me that God must feel about me the way I feel about my son. And then I heard that line in the song that says, I don't have time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way that he loves me. That's what we should feel when we look at the cross. I want you to experience that tonight. Unfortunately, I didn't bring Andrew to hand around during worship, so. But I have something else. What I have is these canvases. There are these big ones on either side of the stage. And by these canvases are going to be these spray bottles. When Jesus went to that cross, when he chose you, when he went to the cross, he took our sin. He took our sin upon himself. He had lived a perfect, a spotless life. But on the cross, he took the sin that he did not commit upon himself to pay a punishment that he does not deserve to punish so that we could walk free. So what I want to do tonight, what I want you to think about tonight, is during this next couple of songs as we worship, you're going to have an opportunity to go to these canvases, to pick up bottles just like this. And as you go to the canvases, the idea is to just spray it. And as you spray, think about the fact that Jesus took your sin and Jesus took your shame. He took it from you onto himself. He absorbed it. He took it away. Give your sin to Jesus. Choose his love the way he chose you. Tonight, put it down. Set it down on Christ. Set it down before the cross. And as you do that, turn your mind and your heart to stop thinking about your sin and your shame and think about the cross of Jesus. Because if you do, you won't have time to maintain your regrets as you think about the way that he loves us. Let's pray together. Father,